Hello YouTube. We're continuing discussing slavery in the Bible, and specifically slavery in the Old Testament. We have just finished discussing a number of passages dealing with slavery, and we've discussed up to this point mainly entry and legal status. Now we're going to turn our attention to treatment of slaves. Slavery, as we understand it, or under pre-Civil War slavery, slaves were frequently mistreated by modern standards and punishments were extreme. As a matter of course, slaves lived in radical separation from their owners and did not participate in many of the benefit of the owner's fortunes. Under the Old Testament, the law forbid harsh treatment, set stipulations for positive treatment, set tight boundaries around the punishment and abuse of servants. Many of God's commands to Israel about treatment of slaves were cast in light of Israel's experience of harsh slavery in Egypt, which generally did conform to the Western paradigm described already. Israel is told to remember her slavery and not to oppress the slave or foreigners in the land. And there are many, many verses relative to this. Deuteronomy 5:6, Deuteronomy 6 verse 12, Deuteronomy 6 verse 21, Deuteronomy 7 verse 8, Deuteronomy 15:15, Deuteronomy 6:12, and Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 18 and 19, and there are many, many more. Not only was the abusive treatment of servants and slaves strictly forbidden, but the law held masters accountable. If a master beat a slave and the slave died, the master was held accountable under the life-for-life clause. If a man beats his male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies as a direct result, he must be punished. Exodus 21 verse 20. Now, if a master caused any type of permanent damage to a servant, the servant was given immediate freedom. If a man hits a manservant or maidservant in the eye and destroys it, he must let the servant go free to compensate for the eye. And if he knocks the tooth out of the manservant or maidservant, he must let the servant go free to compensate for the tooth. This may be unique. By the way, that was Exodus chapter 21, verses 26 through 27. This may be unique to Israel in ancient times. Quoting from a history of ancient Near Eastern law, the above prescription is hugely instructive. In comparison to the ancient Near East, in some ancient Near Eastern codes, a master could literally put out the eyes of his slaves. This represents a massive departure from the conventional morality of the day. And the mentioned prescription is also instructive in comparison to today. Whereas typical insurance programs only pay 50% of the maximum disability for the loss of a single eye, they pay nothing for the loss of a tooth. But in the Old Testament, there was a huge disincentive to strike one's slave in the face. Legitimate community punishments were by rods on the back. Facial blows were considered culpable. The ancient Near East, however, did not have the same respect for the face of slaves. Besides eye gouging, they resorted to branding, cutting of the ears, manipulating the nose, and so on, in their law codes. These practices are not in Israel's law codes, and they were implied to be prohibited by the focus on the penalties for striking the face. According to the World Bible Commentary, this passage is noted as being oddly humanitarian. In the case of bodily injury to slaves whose status did not qualify them for equal compensation, the owner whose abuse results in the loss of an eye or tooth is to free the slave, a remarkably humanitarian provision directed at cruelty in a slave owner. The law allowed disciplinary rod beating of a servant, Exodus 21:20, but apparently under the same conditions as that for free men. Now obviously that brings us to another favorite skeptic passage, Exodus 21:21. Exodus 21:21 says, "Notwithstanding, if a servant remains alive a day or two, he should not be punished, for he is his property." What is astonishing is that skeptics use this passage to support their argument when in fact it completely destroys their premise that slavery as sanctioned in the Mosaic Law is the same as slavery at any time in human history. This restriction on an owner should make one ponder what in the world the word property might mean in such a context. Now, I've already discussed property in a previous video. Again, the interpretation is property refers to the labor, not the person. The passage does not say that the slave owner is not guilty. It says the slave master shall not be punished. Why? Well, for starters, Exodus 21:21 restricts the treatment of the slave to no more severe than what the community elders could do with a regular free citizen. Free citizens could be beaten with rods. Read Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 1 through 3. And actually, these two verses, verses 20 and 21, parallel Exodus 21, verses 18 through 19, in which if one dies in a fight or brawl, the aggressor has to pay a monetary punishment to the victim's family. So basically what you're looking at in Exodus chapter 21, verses 18 through 21 is manslaughter laws. In other words, the passage makes slaves equivalent to free persons. In the case of a free person or free people, manslaughter resulted in a monetary payment, monetary punishment. But in the case of the slave, the loss of labor to the slave owner was the payment or monetary punishment. So in both cases, you have monetary punishment going on. You couple this with the passage that we've just read here in Exodus 21, verses 26 to 27. The master's abuse of the slave results in the slave's freedom. And again, that applied to all slaves. Clearly, the scripture punishments for mistreatment are meant to restrain the abuse of slaves. Quoting from a dictionary of the Old Testament by Alexander and Baker, clearly the personal rights of the slaves overrode or override their master's property rights over them. Now, if a master beats a slave and the slave dies, the master is held accountable under the life-for-life clause. The master was put to death. This alone makes it completely different from slavery in Egypt, other Canaanite nations, and antebellum America. It should be obvious that the slave in this case is raised to at least as high level as the free Hebrew. The Exodus passage is very instructive because it places slaves, both Hebrew and foreigner, apparently on the same legal protection par with full and free citizens. It no more authorizes a master to abuse a slave than it authorizes a Hebrew to bash his fellow Hebrew's head in with a rock, knocking him unconscious for a day or so. Furthermore, notice verse 20 again says, his slave. According to the JPS Torah commentary, the final clause of verse 21 seems to indicate the slave in question is a foreigner. Otherwise, the terminology would be inappropriate given the conditions under which a Hebrew would be classified as a slave. The skeptic's problem oftentimes with verse 21 is the fact that when a beaten slave lingers for more than a day or two before succumbing. However, the skeptic should realize that certain new and mitigating circumstances have arisen. The direct causal relationship between the master's conduct and the slave's death is now in doubt, and the case goes from homicide to manslaughter, for there may have been some unknown intermediate cause. The intent of the master appears less likely to have been homicidal and more likely to have been disciplinary. He is given the benefit of the doubt, especially since he is losing his financial investment, the price of the slave's labor. This in turn means that there is no manslaughter penalty. The punishment as prescribed in verse 21, because the master is the one that is losing his financial investment. Now I wanted to take an opportunity to demonstrate how skeptics often cherry pick passages to support their arguments. They'll spend a lot of time discussing chapter 21 verse 21 and somehow completely miss verse 16. Verse 16 says, anyone who kidnaps another and either sells him or still has him when he's caught must be put to death. This law prevented Hebrews from forced enslavement of others and was punishable by death. This passage, when you couple it with the Great Escape Clause in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 15, which I discussed, I believe, in the second video, would have outright outlawed slave trading. The general scholarly assessment is that most slavery in Israel was domestic slavery and went way beyond our modern day notion of property and instead created family-like bonds. In fact, the law assumes that the situation may have been lucrative enough for servants, which would result in the servant deciding to stay with their masters for their lifetime. Exodus 21:5 and Deuteronomy 15:16. Now what I would like to do now is in the next video I want to turn our attention to motive. Why was slavery allowed to begin with?